this is me one day in my student dorm, and I'm like, oh wow, I should do open source, because at that time I had been using Linux for a multitude of years, LibreOffice, Thunderbird, Firefox, that was all that I used, and it was so like incredibly great feeling, all of these people all over the world like just work on this stuff and I just get to use it for free. And I could pay them back by just doing whatever little thing to help them. And that's really like what got me thinking that way, because I was just so grateful for these people. And every time my Linux updated, it was like, oh wow, more good free stuff from all of these awesome people. So at that time I was thinking like, hey, you know what, like even though if it takes me like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, one time in my life I will take like 2 or 3 weeks off and I'll submit whatever small patch there is to the Linux kernel, so that like I have the stuff and I help these people back out. Then I found out what like an asshole Linus Torvalds is, and I really quickly, went away from that idea, because like, no, that's not for me. I don't want to go through that. But still, the idea persisted in me. And so, oops. And by way of warning, like those drawings are not going to get better throughout the talk. They're only going to get worse. Get used to it. So what did I do? Is I was lucky enough to study at like a very good university, where we actually had a course, even in our bachelor's, that we could optionally go to about open source. So this is all in German, because this is actually the original page of the course I attended. So like, third year of my bachelor's in 2011, you can kind of date me by that. I was given by this guy, at the time Dr. Martin von Löwes, and now Professor Martin von Löwes. And that guy has a Python Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the Python language. And so he was like on this Python council that goes through the PEPs and whatnot. So just an incredibly experienced open source developer. And so I was really grateful to have this opportunity. So like when I saw the course, I was like, wow, I'm gonna do that. And I hope everything is fine here. Yes, wonderful. And so part of that course was that we had to do a contribution to an open source project, to a big open source project. So like we had lectures and we needed to do that. So I figured out I'd take this one. This is a gedit bug. Middle click on tab should close tab, which is something that I had used all my life, but for a long time. Like in Firefox, if you middle mouse click on the tab, it actually closes. And the same thing didn't work in gedit. And so I was like, wow, that sucks. And like at the time, like I was mainly doing Ruby programming, and gedit with like a gazillion plugins was sort of like what I used to do programming at the time. And so I was really excited about this, because it was, you might have heard the phrase, scratch your own itch. Sort of like you have something that bothers you in an open source project, so it's the best to go there and contribute, and that's one of the best ways to get into open source and to do open source, to like fix things that actively annoy you yourself. So I was super hyped about this, because it's like, finally this is my foray into open source. And I spent a lot of time doing it, because like getting gedit to build, even like I installed a new operating system so that I have up-to-date enough packages to maybe build it, and even then it didn't work. And so it took me days to even build gedit so that I could work on it. And then trying to fix it, I actually had to go to my friend Nico, who is a way better C programmer than I am. Like, never pay me to do C programming, like I'm bad at it, but like he helped me do that all. And so I was incredibly proud that finally I had done this. And so I went back to the issue and was like, hey, I did this thing, some things aren't great about it, but here is a patch, please do this, and we can do that. But then this comment came, was like, oh, thanks for the bug report, but like this is a duplicate of this issue, and the other issue just basically says like, no, we don't want that. So that was me. Like I'm not lying, but this was weeks. Probably like a full work week of work, probably more. And I enlisted the help of my friend, right? For free, to help me with all of this. And at this point in time, this might be or might have been the end of this talk, because this could have legitimately been the end of my story in open source. I did all of this work, which I felt was completely needless, because it accomplished nothing, In the end, I was just empty, busy working, and it had no real effect on anyone. One of the reasons for that was like a missing triaging in that project, like Nobody ever looked at that bug. Nobody ever marked it as a duplicate. And so I just went and did needless work. And it really sucked. And like most of all, I felt there was no appreciation for what I've done. It wasn't even acknowledged that I tried to solve this. It was just like flat out closed. It was not like, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't here, and like we should have marked this before, and like I'm really sorry for the time you've lost. It was just like, closing this as a duplicate, bye, you don't matter. So I was incredibly frustrated. And at that time, I was like, hey, open source maybe isn't for me. If that's what the experience is like, I'm never gonna do it. And so yeah. Obviously, this is not, the end of the talk, because otherwise that would have been the shortest full talk in Lambda Days history, and I don't want to do that. Why did I tell you this story? Because I think there's incredibly a lot that we can learn from that story, how contributors feel, what you can do to make contributors welcome, but also some of the pitfalls that you can fall into when you both want to contribute to open source and or run an open source project. So hi, my name is Toby. You can find me on the internet as Practop, on like Twitter, GitHub, and whatnot, or you can find all the links at practop.info. And so this talk is a very personal talk because it's my story, what I did in open source, what worked for me, the projects I worked on, and what kind of learnings I took from all of that. And so I hope you can enjoy that, and we will go on with the silly drawings. So later that year, in 2011, I actually went and moved to Sweden. I did an Erasmus in Sweden for 8 months, and one of the good things for me about Sweden was university was much easier, except for a course by Daya Schmitte, or like all her courses, but they were great. And so I had more time, and so I was kind of like, okay, I have some extra time, I can do something. And so what I did was, I went to Ruby Mendicant University. It's defunct now, but it was basically a program to level you up, or level your skills up in Ruby. Fun thing was, the course was all senior software engineers, except for little student me. I was also in there. And part of the course, again, was to contribute to a open source project. And so I was like, okay, let me give this another shot. Let me give this another shot. I'll do the Mendicant University, I'll contribute to an open source project. Maybe this time it works out. And the project that I chose was Shoes, which maybe, has anyone here heard of Shoes? No. Oh, one person. Way. Oh, two. Like some former Ruby people, some old school Ruby people were on. Yay. So Shoes is a GUI toolkit to like write GUI applications in Ruby. And so this is what a Shoes application looks like. And like I looked at this, so like you can say it's very, very high level. So at the top you can say we just create a background for entire screen from like the color lime to the color blue, and that's just one line. Or like we create a button that does something when you click it, throws up an alert, and all of that. There's no like real hardcore positioning. The positioning is more like, let's say, web-based, so the stack just means like it goes underneath each other. Doesn't matter, but I looked at this and I loved it because like at that time, I always really wanted to make like UI desktop applications to teach kids how to program, for instance. That was one of the things that I really wanted to do, and I wanted to have like an easy, accessible way to do it, and that was it. I saw that, I fell in love with it. When I compared it to like Qt or like GTK, or I was like, this is so much better. This is so great. And I was lucky. The guy that was running at the project at the time was this guy. Does anyone recognize this guy on this picture? I don't think, like, I took a bad picture of him because it was of the first conference talk that I ever watched at the time. So this is Steve Klabnik, which the Rust people might know, and he was running the Shoes project at the time. But yes, Steve Klabnik, before he was big in Rust, was a big Ruby person, and he even has a Ruby tattoo, but yeah. So I watched this talk, I love Shoes, and I fell in love, and he was also like a bit associated with the Mendicant University at the time, and so I reached out to him. And let me tell you, I did all the things wrong. I sent him just personal emails all the time with questions about that, what to do and whatnot, and he was just like the nicest guy ever. He answered all of them. He was really nice, really supportive. I was like, yeah, Toby, do this, Toby, do this. And like he then wrote an email to like the mailing list to introduce me. He was like, hey, this is Toby. Toby's working on this great thing. And I just felt so warm and so welcome. Like sometime later, my project coordinator basically at Mendicant University was like, No, you don't email the maintainer the whole time, like you go to the mailing list, you go to the bugs, like you don't do that. I was like, oh shit, but like Steve never said a word. Steve was just the most amazing supportive person. And that's sort of like what developing shoes was like for me. So little small history lesson, there's this Y up there. So Y the Lucky Stiff is a legendary Ruby programmer who disappeared basically a year or so before I started working on the project, which is why the project needed new maintainership. And he did so because kind of people found out his real name, and he was always this kind of secretive. He was this very, I don't know, majestic, artistic person. And so this was a very artistic and fun place. And so this is why there's all this color in there, because it was just all of us getting together. So this is me, obviously. This is Steve, obviously. This is my friend Jason, and this is my friend Eric Watson, and this is HBB. So it was just this entirely fun place where we were like, oh, let's do this, or like, let's revive shoes, let's make a new version of shoes so people can enjoy it. And we had this amazing energy, and everybody was always supportive and welcoming. And that was the one that stuck to me the most from that time, because like some people, you could see my first experience in open source was very much like no appreciation, nothing, and just denial. And here, it was like a completely different ballgame. Just people were supportive and nice, and so that's, to this day, something that I always want to replicate for all my open source projects, this kind of like atmosphere. And then I made good friends with all those people, or like with most of them. Like I met Steve, sometime in real life, which was amazing. I met Jason for the first time at a beach at Full Stack Fest in Barcelona. I remember that, and one of my favorite memories in my life. I don't know if you've seen the movie Inside Out, but there's this concept of like a core memory. And the core memory of myself is debugging something with Eric Watson, who's actually from Minnesota. And so I think we met at like 10 or 11 Berlin, Germany time. And I was like, wait, this early? Isn't that too early for you? Isn't that like 6 or something for you? It's like, yeah. So, you want to do that before your kids get away? It's like, yeah. And so, like he had like 5 or 6 kids, I don't know. And so we worked on this, and you could see throughout the time, his kids got awake and were running around in the background. And because the debugging took so long of what we were doing, I'll never forget this. At some point, like his little son comes to him and has like a truck in his hands, like, his truck, and it's like, and then Eric goes like, oh, do you want to show that truck to my friend Toby? And then he showed the truck to me in the camera, and it's like, first he called me friend, and then, all of that. That is just like a thing where I'm still to this day, I'm very sad, like, although he also later contributed to another project of mine, and like, but I've never met Eric Watson in real life, which is still very sad, because I met most of the other people in real life this far. The other thing that I learned there was to give people access and give them early. Like, if you contribute to an open source project, you made like 1 or 2 contributions or 3, and they're good, and then you get access, that's such a morale and motivation boost. It's like, oh, wow, these people trust me with what I'm doing. And it's just really great, and you get started. And so we started out giving access to the repository relatively early to people, and it really sort of like boosted their morale as well. The other thing that I learned, by the way, sorry, the fonts don't work, so it's a bit messed up. The other thing that I learned was to release software early and release it often. Like one of the biggest mistakes that I made in Shoes. So we wrote Shoes 4, which was a re-implementation of the previous Shoes version. And I was sadly of the very dumb opinion that we should only release a version of it once it's 100% compatible with the previous version, which was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made when it comes to Shoes. Because if you don't release something, like sure, people can clone it from GitHub, but you never have a release announcement. People never see it. People never start playing with it. You never get all those bug reports in and whatnot. And you never get new contributors. Not never. We got new contributors. We got all of that. But like releasing that would have been much better. We started releasing it way too late. So like Jason insisted at some point, and Jason was right, obviously. And we got that going. And also, just as sort of like a measure, so Shoes 4 from like the project size or like the popularity, so Shoes 4 is about, I think, 1,500 stars on GitHub. So that, and like, I think Shoes 3, the original one, had like a couple of thousand stars on GitHub. So another disclaimer, like I won't tell you what it's like to work in like the Rust core project or like Rails core, like these really big projects. I never was a core member of any of those, but I believe most of us never will be. And so I believe that my experience in sort of like smaller but still big and relevant projects is more relevant to sort of like the average developer. And the other thing that I learned sort of like a little bit painfully, that you are not your open source. So for a long time in my life, sort of like doing shoes as open source was part of my identity, really. And so when it didn't release, it didn't get to the state. So shoes 4 to this day is unfinished. Like it never reached 100% compatibility with shoes 3. And that really weighed on me for a very long time. I remember going in the car with my friend Arne, and he was just saying, Toby, but like, don't worry about it. You gave that your all, and like, it's fine. If you want to do something else, do something else. And that was really important for me to hear, because I was stressing to like, oh, we need to get this released, we need to get this. And I was stressing, and I was, losing the joy of working on it. And, you need to have some joy. Next project is After Do, which is an incredibly small project. So that's only like 100 lines of Ruby code. And it is also, it only has like 100 stars on GitHub, but it's a fun little micro library that I did. So what it does is it implements aspect-oriented programming. Does anyone here know what aspect-oriented programming is? Oh, wow, a surprising amount of people, nice. So aspect-oriented programming basically says there's all of these cross-cutting concerns when we write our programs. The chief example is logging. You add logging to all of your code. It's mixed in with your business code. You have no central space where you have like, this is where all my logs go. And what aspect-oriented programming allows you to do, as in here, I just take a class. I know it's sacrilege to show class code at Lambda days. I apologize. But so what I do here is basically I tell it to like, after the method bark is called, do this thing. And so I could put like a logger in there, and so I could loggers before and after, or even around method invocations, and I still give you access to the entire instance. So that is it's a pretty neat concept. Not that many applications, but we actually used it in shoes to define when redraws happen. So it was like, okay, after you did this thing, or before you do this thing, do a redraw, or mark this area for redraw, basically. So this was my little sort of like shiny little micro library that I was very proud of. And what I learned is micro libraries are great. Like, it doesn't take a lot of time to write them, because, as I said, it's 100 lines. I mean, it was pretty complicated meta programming, but honestly, Wise Code prepared me for that, so that's fine. But it doesn't need a lot of maintenance or whatnot. It just keeps working, which is really, really great. And the other thing that I learned here, that the usage of such a project is completely wild, because as you see, it was a very simple interface, and I've always thought about putting like some meta layer on top of it, so that's reusable, and you can even more easily define all of that stuff. And then somebody opened an issue, and they proposed such a meta layer to add it to After Do, but was a completely different meta layer from what I had envisioned. It worked completely different, had completely different constraints, but was completely valid. So what I learned there is also there is sense of beauty and like the simplicity, like keeping one library very simple at its core, sort of like the Unix philosophy, and then maybe if you want to add on top, do another library that uses that library, but it's cool to keep it nice and simple. And then the thing that maybe some people here know me from is Benchy, which is basically, thankfully right now, the benchmarking library used in Elixir, and you can also use it for Erlang and stuff. And it's great. I'm very proud of it. If you want to know more about Benchy, I gave a talk here, I don't know, 4 years ago or something, about Benchy and all that it can do. But yeah, basically it does benchmarks, and it does them very well, very precise. It can even measure memory, and it can memory consumption, and it can also measure reductions, which is sort of like an internal way of like how the beam counts usage, basically. But time is, of course, the other thing. And Benchy for me was this really great project, because I came to the Elixir world, and like I'm a benchmarking nerd. I love benchmarking. And so I basically wanted to recreate, at first, a library from Ruby. And I did that in the first release, and then I just kept improving it to the point where I now want Benchy, basically in Ruby. So because like now it's so much better than benchmark IPS in Ruby. So this was a lot of love of benchmarking, measuring for myself, and like trying to get people to use it. And one of the first things that I get as like a learning from there is that people often come to me like, Toby, you're so great, you're so good, like I could have never, written Benchy, your knowledge of the Beam VM is so superior, it's so good. And it's like, no, you got this the wrong way around. Like, it's not that my knowledge of the Beam was so good, so I could write Benchy. I wrote Benchy. I needed to learn about the beam, and that's why my knowledge about the beam is so good. So like the relationship to that is inverse. So that's a lot of things that you can really do with open source. You can learn about whatever topic you work on, and you will become an expert in it, most likely, relatively quickly. Not saying that I'm really an expert in the Beam VM, but I'm competent, let's say. The other thing that I also learned there is that better isn't enough. There was another benchmarking library in the Elixir ecosystem called Benchfeller. And first, by the way, which is always the better call, first, before you go on writing your own thing, try if you can see to improve the existing thing, because like divergence in the ecosystem is never like that good or like rarely. And so I tried to improve that library, but like it had out-commented code all over the place. There was no great test coverage, and like my PR wasn't answered within like 2 weeks or something. So that's the point where I decided I'll write my own thing. But despite like, I honestly think that the first release of Benchy was already better than Benchfeller. It took, I think, 2 years or something for sort of like the download and the usage numbers to catch up to that. So the very good learning here is that just creating a better library isn't enough. People won't magically start using your library just because it's better. You need to go give conference talks. You need to write blog posts. In the case of a benchmarking library, it's really nice. You just write like a benchmark of something interesting, and then you use your benchmarking library, and then you post it, and then people like it and they read it. And so you need to do all of this sort of like community building and evangelizing, and it can be kind of like hard in the beginning because like, it's so much better, just use it. But it takes some time. It takes some good time and takes some good work to make it that popular. And the other thing that I love about Benchy, I mean, I had co-maintainers with shoes, but at Benchy, I don't know, some of you might know Devin Estes. He's also a good Elixir developer. He became my co-maintainer with Benchy. And one of my favorite things we ever did was we got together at my house because Devin also lives in Berlin. And we just discussed naming for 2 hours straight. We went and read papers and whatnot about benchmarking, about other things, and so we came up with the terminology that we still use in Benchy to this day because it was always kind of confusing what we did and whatnot. We also kind of changed some of the data structures around a bit, but that was secondary. Like the most important thing was we just talked about naming. It was really cool to like be there with him and talk about it. And by the way, also for the Learn As You Go, Devin has a very cool talk where he talks about how memory measurement works and also how garbage collection works in the Beam VM. And that talk just came straight out of us trying to figure out how to measure memory consumption in Benchy. So like Devin also didn't go up and know this. He learned it through like a long, hard time developing Benchy. And personally, one of my personal favorite or proudest moments or like small lifetime achievements, this is an excerpt, I think it's only 1 or 2 pages long, from the book Adopting Elixir that like Jose has written together with Ben Marks and Bruce Tate. And there's a section about benchmarking, and they use Benchy. And that's a published book at my favorite publisher, Pragmatic Programmers. And so I'm just I was like, we made it, we are the de facto benchmark. I mean, I know Jose is using Benchy, I sometimes get bug reports from him, not bug reports, but feature requests from him. And I know he uses it to make Elixir faster. But like having it in a book, my library for my favorite publisher was like a personal, very big event to me. Another project, sorry that we're going back to Ruby, but I'm also the maintainer these days of SimpleCoff, which is the code coverage library in Ruby that people use. And that's what that looks like for me. So it's this entire big house. It's like a big legacy open source project. And you can see stuff is broken everywhere. You don't know where anything is. People work somewhere, do something. Some people just chill out and do whatever. And I'm down here. I'm the little sort of like handyman that tries to go around and like fix shit all the time. And so it's very tough work because, so this is a very huge project. I think it has like 280 million downloads or something like that. It has like 4,500 stars on GitHub or whatnot. And it's very tough. Part of the toughness is that with a code coverage library, nobody wants to understand how the library works. They just want to add it to the project and magically work. So like debugging that is hell oftentimes. And I sort of got into that because like I didn't want to become the maintainer of this library actually. So I only wanted for them to add JRuby support because it worked on JRuby but was never officially supported. So I met with the maintainer in Hamburg and was like, okay, you get access. But then the kind of person that I am is like, I get access, I'm now a maintainer, and there's all of these bugs. I said I'll only do JRuby support, but I can't let that stand, right? I need to work on it, I need to make it better, and so I became like a fuller maintainer. I will never forget like how stupid we were at the time, because they said like, library is stable, nothing will happen, probably there's no work done. It's like, okay, cool. And then, like Rails and everyone changed the way they do things, and that affected the library. They came out with new code coverage mechanisms in Ruby, and we needed to do that, and it's a lot. But it's a great jar of impact, because like a shit ton of people use Simplecov. So whenever I make it better, I make it faster, I add a new feature, I make something better for so many people, and that is really, really enjoyable to me. But the problem is the integration nightmares, because part of like how this library works is it depends on the order in which the files are loaded. So whenever any library messes with that, or messes what happens at process exit, it affects us. And we need to work around their stuff, because they're all like, no, that's not our fault, it's your fault. And so we need to watch what Minitest does, what Rails does, what all of these other things, what parallel test does. And it's really, really tough. So it's oftentimes actually not as enjoyable to work on that, but it is fun to get that done. There's another kind of open source project that I want to talk about, but this one is more abstract, and this is open source at work. And I get this question a lot, sort of like during like interviews. Oh, do you do open source and whatnot? And it's like, oh, we should open source something. Everyone's like, yay, we should open source stuff. It's the best. Woohoo! The reality of that, sadly, in most companies looks different. You open source something at some point, but there is rarely time to work on it. Like everybody's like, oh, work on the main application, and you sort of forget about the stuff that you open sourced, because usually it's hard if it's not one of the main things that you do. Like, who's responsible for that? You get bugs in, you need to add new features, all of those things, but nobody's responsible for it. You just open source it at some point, then it just goes there and it stays there. There's no dedication to it, and that's problematic because then, like, you just basically you open source a part of your application and you put it out on the internet, but basically it's just you using it, because you don't do all of the things that you actually require to do. You don't give the talks, you don't write the blog post about it. It just sits there, and most likely almost nobody uses it. It's different if you have a dedicated team to it, right? Or if it's your product is open source. But I'm talking about like this side project where you like took this one small library and you just open sourced it. And so I'm sad to say I've never seen that actually work. Like, it works at big places, like Shopify has dedicated teams for their open source stuff and whatnot. And like when Erlang Solutions works on the open source stuff, there's dedicated people working on that. But in most companies, that's just not the case. So as much as I love open source, I sometimes think it's a bit of a waste to do that. Like, not waste, but like you need to dedicate more time and attention to it. So I am, and I was very active in open source, but then things happened in the world. I mean, we all remember this, right? COVID hit, and it was tough for me. Like, I was scared. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen, and I realized that all of a sudden, I had lost sort of like a lot of the mind space that I had for actually doing open source. And then the next thing happened. Russia further invaded Ukraine, and so my best friend was born in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine every 3 pre-pandemic years. I was invited to like Lviv, I was in Kiev, and like I have friends there. And so this really, really hit me hard. And like, by the way, it says further invades Ukraine, because I never forget like the first time I came to Ukraine with my best friend was like, because he doesn't speak Ukrainian, he only speaks Russian, was like, hey, is it okay to speak Russian here? And at the same time, at that time it was still okay, but just say, but what we don't understand is how all of you forgot about the war going on in our country on the eastern side. Like, after the invasion in 2014, most people had just forgotten and just like carried on like nothing happened. And that is something that I'll never forget. So it's like further invade. They didn't invade, they just continued the invasion. More things happened. I started working at a company, very big company. It wasn't good for me. Like, I was super stressed. I couldn't do any open source. Like, I didn't have the mind space to do it. And then I got to another company that was better, but then also later there were layoffs and like a bunch of other stress, which also was a big bunch of stress for me, and I didn't have the time. And even worse than that, in the previous company, even like I got problems with my arms. I couldn't program anymore for a while, and when I could, I focused on getting work done so that I get paid. And it took me more than a year to actually get my arms back into a working condition where I could, do some open source, or I could, play some games. I couldn't play games for a year, which I'm not sure how many gamers are here, but like it's a great way for me to relax, and I couldn't do that for a year, which was pretty shitty. So that all contributed. And this one, most of you don't know, and I'll try to explain to you, but like I'm very known for having bunnies. If you ever contributed to one of my open source projects and I reviewed a PR from you, ever, anywhere, you've seen a picture of my bunnies. Lots of the times, if I report an issue to the project, there's a good chance that you've seen a picture of my bunnies. If you've seen a talk from me in the last 6 years, there was a picture of my bunnies in there. I work at a 1,000-people company. About 600 of those people know the bunnies all by their names, and because I often show them in meetings and whatnot. So like even in the all hands, I will take just the camera down when they're doing something cute and show the bunnies, to all of the other people. So what I'm just saying is like I really, really love my bunnies, and especially one of them, my favorite, was born with both a heart condition and a digestive condition. And so it was normal for her to be stationary at the vet every 2 to 3 months. And my really good friends, they know when they ask me how I'm doing, they don't ask how I'm doing, they ask how are the bunnies doing, because they know that reflects best on sort of like how I'm doing. And so that was rough. So I still remember like the day that Russia further invaded Ukraine, I was sitting in a cab with both bunnies at the time on the way to the vet, and they were sick for a month, 3 weeks of that at the vet. Then last December, so there was, actually I think Jose isn't here, yeah, but like there was actually an issue with Benchy, or like an extension of Benchy for I think Lifebook compatibility that Jose was asking me to work on. And so, but then one of the bunnies got sick 2.5 weeks and almost died multiple times. She miraculously pulled through, and I started working on the issue. I was ready to release it, which was at the end of December. And then the other bunny was sick, and he got diagnosed with cancer. And that's the last time, beginning of this year, that I've ever looked at this issue, because since then, 2 months later, he died. And now actually, which is one of the saddest parts, 2.5 weeks ago, Ghost also died due to her digestive condition, which I can't talk too much about, because otherwise I'll cry on stage, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants to see that meme, but it's been rough, and so I still haven't fixed that issue. So why am I telling you all of this? Why am I oversharing all of this personal stuff? Do I want your pity or whatnot? No. It goes back to a conversation that I had with my friend Duana Stanley, actually in Kiev when we were walking through a park, and she just asked me, and like I have the utmost respect for her. Like she's one of the programs that I respect the most. She just asked me, "Hey, Toby, how do you do all this? Like, how do you work on all of these open source projects and like organize the Ruby user group in Berlin? Like how? How do you have the time?" And like, it's a question I've never been asked before. I was dumbfounded. I didn't know how to answer that question because I just did. It was just what I did. It was in my daily life, After work, I just would go home. I would work on open source. It was the most normal thing for me ever. But I realized through all of this that I was very lucky and privileged that I didn't have all of that stress or like all of that stuff weighing down on me too much so that I could do that. And so I started reflecting on that. And now after all of these sort of like years, like being out of it for a big chunk, I realized actually how hard it is to pick it up again, because it's, you're just not used to it anymore. You don't have the time, other stuff took up the time in your space, and it's kind of tough. And it goes back to actually the first talk that I mentioned by Steve Klabnik. He has this slide in the talk, so more than 10 years ago, and where he was talking about that OSS is made of people, and he talks about his favorite programmers, most of which you probably don't know, but this is Zed Shaw that left the Ruby community with a blog post titled, I think, Rails is a Ghetto, so you can see how that went. Why left? Because like his name being found out. Yehuda Katz, you probably still know from the JavaScript community, but he used to be big in Rails. There is Aaron Patterson, which is my personal favorite programmer of all time. And Steve was thinking that Aaron might burn out and stuff, but thankfully Aaron is still working and kicking. And then there's Wayne Segreen, who left over basically a controversy. He was implementing like the RVM, the version switcher for Ruby, and then somebody else came out, wrote a blog post, "Oh, RVM is so bad and does all of these things in a very shitty way. Use my project instead." And that drove him out of open source because it was his project, was his time that he put in. And sometimes we forget that there is like people that work on these things, that do these things, and when, although I said you are not your open source, when somebody goes and like heavily criticizes and just says like, this is shit, this is dangerous, and what you do, it really impacts people and it impacts their lives. And so what I want to say is that open source owes you shit. And for me, that also translates to I owe you shit. And that sounds very harsh to say from me, but it's an attitude that is needed in a certain degree to not bomb yourself out about that too much. And there's often people that make the most wildest complaints. Like I remember also many years ago, Jose had another library which is called Device, which was what everybody in Ruby used for authentication. And there was a guy coming there, oh, you don't even support this simple use case. What the fuck is this? Implement this very fast. And I saw this issue before even Jose saw it. And so I was like, no, like, you shut the fuck up. You know, like, you can implement, you can fork this, you can do this, you can do whatever. Like, don't go here demanding stuff from open source maintainers. That's not right. That's not cool. So that's sadly something that often is. So what I want to say is that even though if you work on something, any sort of like free time project, you know, it's your project, it's your free time. If you want to do something else with your time, that's fine. You know, I had a lot of problems with that regarding shoes because I started working on Benchy and I enjoyed working on Benchy much more, but I was like, I should still finish shoes. But no, I enjoyed working on Benchy more, and so I should be working on Benchy. So while this sounds very negative, like, I'm doing all of this because I love creating. You know, when people tell me like, wow, Benchy is my favorite library and like it helps me so much with the thing, that lightens up my heart. When I organize the Ruby user group and all the people show up and they're very happy, that's also very, very happy to me, you know? And I just want to remind people to take care sort of like of themselves, because like we don't need more open source maintainers to burn out, and there's a lot of them that do. Be nice when you contribute to projects and be appreciative of what people do. So if you want to take your first steps into open source, which I'm not sure for how many here that is relevant, but even for those that still have done it for a long time, first, most important, like, please report issues. I can't fix a thing if I don't know that it's broken, you know? And it's something that is very underappreciated, I think, because some people think that contributing to open source is only sending in merge requests or patches. They're like, no, reporting an issue is very, very valuable. And so I'm sometimes amazed how I can see people that, I don't know, work for 2 years full-time and never reported even like a bug on GitHub. And it's like, I don't know, I report bugs in libraries every couple of months or sometimes multiple a month, because like there's stuff and it's just, it takes a little time to report it, but it helps the community, it helps the project, and it helps you ultimately if it gets fixed. Be nice when you report the issue. So I always start reporting an issue with, hey, thank you so much for this project. It has helped me a lot to do this. Because legitimately, when I report a bug, it means I use the library, which means it needs to be somehow useful to me. So it's first, I don't know, for me, it's like, show the appreciation to maintainer, because we rarely get that appreciation, actually. And then the most important and the hardest part is like minimizing the problem and at best reproducing the problem to show, you know, this is the mistake and here you can run it so you can fix it. For instance, with SimpleCoff, it's super hard because people are just like, oh, the code coverage in my billions of lines of code Rails app is wrong, please fix. And it's like, sure, where do I start? What do I do? Thank you. So it's very frustrating. And if you do this, I don't actually remember from like which open source project this is, but like people are generally very happy if you approach it in this way. So you can see like very happy for the appreciation and also for the reproduction. And that is work, and it's important work. The other thing is like, first, if you encounter a bug, like open an issue and then discuss the solution. There might be things that you don't know about like the API or the way that this is going to go. Maybe the maintainer actually disagrees and this thing shouldn't even be in the project itself. And they would want to have it in another project. So discuss the solution at first, discuss what it needs to be done, and only then start working on it. Because, you know, eventually, maybe add a pull request. You don't need to, but one of the anti-patterns that I sometimes see is that people see something or want something in a library and just add all of this code without understanding of the project and whatnot. It can work, but oftentimes it's better to open an issue first, discuss with the maintainer, get some pointers where to do it, what kind of like API they want, and if they want this at all. Another sort of like fun side story that I have for me is like, you know, with COVID, we all hit this era of like remote work and whatnot, and is that fine or whatnot? And open source is all remote work. Like, I've been doing remote work all my life, you know? That's me there in Berlin, and then, you know, Jason was in Portland, I think Eric was in like Minnesota, There was also Davo was working in it from Sweden. HBB was down there in Japan. It works. Most of open source is, developed in asynchronous remote way without many or any sync calls. It works. So like the whole debate of like, oh, does remote work just seems silly to me, because some of the best and most complex projects on the world have been developed in such a way for the longest time. So be nice when you contribute. It's your open source, it's your time. If you want to do a funny little library that does aspect-oriented programming in Ruby and it's probably not of much use, be my guest. As long as it's fun, sometimes also just great to break out from everyday programming. So one of my other fun things that I didn't mention is like I wrote a Go engine for the game of Go that does implements the Monte Carlo tree search algorithm. I wrote it in Ruby and in CoffeeScript, and it's just fun. Like it's never going to be the best engine, but it does something different from web development, and I enjoy programming because it's like creative. And also adoption takes time, and it takes a lot of time. So be aware of that. Keep pushing. Keep working on the library. Reach out. That said, OSS also has some negative points to it. So already in the programming community, even if you look around the room here, we're not very diverse. And like in open source, it's even less so. It's more guys and even more white guys. Part of that has to do with privilege and care time. And that's also something that I realized through my time now where I had more problems and I couldn't, I just didn't have the mind space to contribute to open source that much. And it's something where we need to do a lot better. The other question is also, is all of this actually sustainable? Like we've made great strides for a long time where we have like GitHub sponsorships and like Patreons and whatnot. So for instance, I'm very happy that Louis Piefold, like his work on Gleam, like he gets a lot of money on, like there's some money on GitHub sponsors, but if I don't get the story wrong, at some point, GitHub sponsorships just removed PayPal support, and that removed, I think, 70% of the money that Louis was getting, and that's really, really rough. So if you ever supported Gleam, which is like a statically typed language, or like fancily typed language on the Beam, like, maybe give him some money. He's great. And another thought that I also want to have for you is, what about people using open source for evil? There's a very mean company called Palantir. They use Ruby, they use Python, they use all of that. And then you get into like the moral question, the moral dilemma of like, okay, I contributed to like Sinatra and or else, and now that code is used to navigate bomb strikes in Afghanistan. Am I responsible for the people dying there? It's like, I don't want to bum anyone out too much, but that's what people can do with the software you provide them. And so to close this one out, for me, it all started with shoes. So I made friends, so this is, so this is me and my friend Jason, actually pair programming at a conference in Berlin at the wonderful Eurocamp. This is my friend Arne Brasseur, Plexus, which I realize some people might know because he's big in like the Clojure community. He has like Lambda Island, and he developed Chestnut and whatnot. He's an awesome person. Like he was the first person that ever recognized me for my open source. Like he came up at a Ruby user group and was like, "Oh, are you Toby? Oh, you're doing shoes? Awesome!" And we've been very good friends ever since. Also, my first talks that I ever gave were all shoes related. I gave my first talk at the Ruby user group, which was very nervous, and like actually a couple of months later, I ended up taking over the Ruby user group, and I've now been running it for like 11 years. I gave my first Lightning talk at Wrocław AB in Poland, where my friend Anna motivated me to give the Lightning talk. I went up on stage, and then Steve was actually sitting there and was like, "Oh, Toby, it's you, nice, I prepared a mic for you," and like helped me my first Lightning talk at a conference, which was a really big thing for me. And then also my first full-length talk was also about shoes at JRubyConf EU in Berlin. So it gave me a lot of things. I learned so much about all the things about programming due to working with all these great programmers and due to creating all of this. And basically, all of the other projects have their roots somehow in shoes. Like AfterDo was created also to help with the redrawing in shoes, as I mentioned. My love for benchmarking comes from a time when we had performance problems in shoes. And so Jason taught me how to benchmark, and I wrote a blog post about it, and I started loving benchmarks, and that's why I love benchmarks, that's why I created Benchy. And the reason why I wanted to have JRuby support in Simplecov was because shoes was written in JRuby, and we used Simplecov for code coverage. So basically, all my open source projects ultimately ended up at via shoes. So it can be a great journey. It can help your professional development and whatever very much. And so I do hope that you enjoy open source.
That was telling, the applause. Guys, now you are facing a very difficult dilemma because either you run out to get lunch or you ask questions. So what do you want to do? Okay, I think we have the answer.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. In terms of hours, how flexible is it to be in open source? And sort of two halves to this question. One half is, when you're not struggling, how much time do you end up spending in a week maintaining all these libraries? And the other half is it possible, if you only have 3 hours, 5 hours a week, to do open source work?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the question was, just to repeat it, sort of like how much time do I spend up, in a week working on open source? And it widely varies, but that's also something that I've grown to. Like, before all of this experience, I would have stressed so much about like not fixing that bug in Benchy, not even looking at the bug tracker for CentOS. And that's why maybe I overemphasize this open source OSU shit, and like I haven't looked at it in so long, and I still feel fine. And like I used to stress about it. And so you can go in and out. Like I have people that contribute. They come, one day, they contribute, and then they come back another day. And so 3-5 hours is totally enough, depending on the size of the project and what you do. But like, every open source maintainer clamors to have like contributors join. It's like one of the most fun things, and you always, I at least try to make the experience the best that I can. So 3-5 hours is totally enough. And like even during my high time, some weeks I would only spend 3-5 hours. But also, to be quite honest, during the hardcore days, I once had a GitHub streak of, I think, 450 days or something. And I would literally every day, after like my studies, so I was still a student at the time, I would do my studies until like 20 o'clock or something, and I would do open source until 1 or 2 o'clock, due to the time that like some of the Americans came online and I talked to them. So I used to work quite a lot, but that's not very sustainable. But these days, I don't think, even if I worked hardcore on it, I wouldn't put in much more. But sometimes you really need to take like a big consecutive chunk of time. Like sometimes I really need to take a day to figure out one issue. And I know like I can't figure this issue out in just 2 or 3 hours in the evening. I need to take like my Saturday, and my Saturday now is figuring out this bug and fixing this bug. And it can be tough, but the good thing is that you don't owe people stuff, so you can take your time.